Good. This is the third week of the Public Health Institute 2005, and it's a pleasure to see all of you here this evening for this presentation. I always feel as though I should say Dr. Osterholm needs no introductions, but it's always a privilege and a pleasure to do so. So please, I would like to introduce our speaker and the topic for tonight. Dr. Michael Osterholm is the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, CIDRAP, and he is also the associate director of the Department of Homeland Security, National Center for Food Protection and Defense, as well as, we're very glad to say, a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. He is also a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. Quite an honor and quite a privilege to have someone with Dr. Osterholm's stature here with us tonight. From 2001 through early 2005, Dr. Osterholm, in addition to his roles as described, was a special advisor to Secretary Tommy Thompson on issues related to bioterrorism and public health preparedness. Previous to his work at this national level, he was also serving here in Minnesota for 25 years in various roles with the Minnesota Department of Health, the last 15 as the state epidemiologist and the chief of acute disease epidemiology section. Dr. Osterholm has been a national and international leader detailing the growing concerns regarding the use of biological agents as catastrophic weapons, as well as those issues that he will be addressing tonight on pandemic influenza, the harbinger of things to come. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Osterholm.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb, for that very, very kind introduction. Actually, I'm very proud to say the longest single affiliation I have of anything in my life except for my family name is I've been on the staff at the University of Minnesota since 1978. So, and that has never stopped. So that's been a very dear and near affiliation. Well, first of all, it's a very hot night in Minneapolis. For those people who are from out of town, we actually here in Minnesota live two lives. One where your head's in the freeze, the other one where your feet are in the oven. On average, your temperature's just right. So, believe it or not, the average annual temperature in Minneapolis is 50 degrees. Today is the other side of that, minus 40. But it's maybe somewhat fitting tonight that we're here on such a hot night to talk about what I believe is the single hottest topic right now in the area of infectious diseases, public health, medicine, social and economic implications for the world, et cetera, et cetera. I can't imagine a topic of more importance, and that's a pretty grandiose statement to make, and tonight I hope to be able to justify that for you as to why I believe that to be the case. Now, setting the tone for this talk tonight, a harbinger of things to come, let me give you my punchline right from the start. For those who've already heard this talk this last week, we're in the pandemic flu class. Some of you who took my infectious disease course, I don't know if you're burnt out. I'm burnt out already from this Public Health Institute. I'm sure you must be in terms of all you've had to do. But tonight, the punchline is that in all of the work that I've done in public health from 1975 to the current time, I think if you add up HIV/AIDS, bioterrorism, foodborne disease, antibiotic resistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think I could honestly and legitimately say adding them all up together probably will not equal the overall societal impact that this particular situation will hear. That's a very, very sobering idea for me to think about, in that as I, hopefully not close to ending my career yet, but ultimately there can't be anything more important than I can think of. And tonight I will share with you why I believe that to be the case. I will share with you why I believe that we're so ill prepared and what we must do. It's not enough just to call the code. It's also an important issue to say, if we're going to say it's so bad, then what could we have or should we have been doing about it? And what might we still do? Now, for those who have been in my class last week, you know this slide is the single most important slide I own. If I had to get rid of all the other slides that I could possibly have, this is the one that is near and dear to my heart. This is truly one picture worth a million words. In this particular slide, I don't think I have a pointer up here, but you can see on the left axis days to circumnavigate the globe, and the right axis population in billions. If you look at the population in billions, that's pretty remarkable what's happened since 1850, when on the face of the earth there was about 400 million people. That's it. Today there are 6.5 billion people. When you think about it in large numbers, maybe what's better context is 1 out of every 9 people who's ever lived, dating back to 80,000 generations to the caves, is now on the face of the earth. That's remarkable. If you look at the travel issue, concurrent with that, 150 years ago it took a year to circumnavigate the globe. Well, in about 1950 we were able to do that in a little over 40 some hours. We haven't gotten any really faster than that. Jet travel is about the same. But what has changed dramatically is how much of everything that circumnavigates the globe in terms of people and goods, animals, etc. This combination is absolutely deadly from an infectious disease standpoint. And it's one that tonight will be front and center as it relates to the issue of pandemic influenza. Keep this in the backdrop of this entire lecture, because it's upon this particular stage that we will actually be acting out our play called Pandemic Influenza. Now, Dr. Ed Kilbourne, a famous influenzaologist, said in 1997, in the case of pandemics, we are planning for the equivalent of a tornado, rare and completely unpredictable till the last minute when a weather watch, e.g. pandemic alert, appears on the TV screen. I show that because I think that at one time that may have been considered the correct assumption to make about pandemic influenza. I don't believe that's the case anymore. I think given the New World Order, we're rewriting the natural history of influenza, and particularly pandemic influenza, and I'll explain more in a moment why I think that to be the case. I think we do have warning. I think we've had warning. I will also disclose right now, front and center, without any embarrassment, with rather a lot of humility, I knew a hell of a lot more about infectious diseases 5 to 10 years ago than I know today. The more I've learned, the more I realize I didn't know, and for that matter, I think most of society doesn't know. Influenza is clearly one of those areas. As soon as we accept dogma, we will be, I think, in for a very, very rude awakening. I saw that very clearly post 9/11, having been very involved with the issue of bioterrorism and having written a lot about it before 9/11 and having been brought into the Secretary's office right afterwards. I sat through meeting after meeting of the old bioweaponeers, the people who had made their livings determining the best way to take a biologic agent and make it into a weapon, who absolutely swore, unequivocally swore on a stack of scientific papers and their credibility that you could not re-aerosolize Bacillus anthracis spores, only to find out how easy it was to do it. I think we all have to take a dose of humility here and say when we know, why we know, and how we know, and acknowledge that maybe it may change in the future as we know more. For having said that, then I think the situation we're really at today is that which Ed Marcuse from Seattle, a pediatrician, said very nicely in 2003, the pandemic clock is ticking, we just don't know what time it is. And I fear desperately that the pandemic is right with us now. That clock, I don't think, could be much closer to midnight. Now, as by way of background, let me just share an overview of influenza and what we know about it in the context of why it's such an important issue. I promise this won't be a virology lecture. But it's important to note this is an orthomyxovirus. It has 8 different segments of negative-stranded RNA. That's important because the way this virus duplicates itself, replicates, is one of the most sloppy, promiscuous ways that any infectious agent could propagate itself. And that has really important implications for why influenza is a different kind of bug. Think about this just for a moment. What other infectious agent that we currently have a vaccine for that requires us every year to change the vaccine to meet the new strain or the strain emerging for that next year? We don't do that with mumps, measles, rubella. We don't do that with any other standard infectious agents. This one's a very different one, and that's in part due to this very indiscriminate, promiscuous kind of replication, which I'll talk about more later. The type designation is based on an antigenic character of the N protein located in the virus envelope and the nucleoprotein within the virus particle. A big mouthful to basically say there are three types of influenza viruses, A, B, and C. And B and C we're going to take off the table tonight. For reasons well beyond the scope of this lecture, we don't worry about those because they don't have the potential to change quickly and cause the kind of human disease problems we see with influenza A. Influenza A is the pandemic strain of concern. Now, I mentioned already, based on that first slide, that there are a number of implications for influenza in the modern world that are very different than yesteryear. The increased factors of travel, urbanization, world population, agricultural practices, and a global economy based on just-in-time delivery. You know, we use this term far too frequently, and I think in some ways, therefore, we've kind of made it almost vanilla. But the concept of a perfect storm, that meteorologic term of all the wrong things happening at the right location, or however you'd like to look at it, could not be a more true description of where we're at right now with the issue of influenza. In addition to these issues of the travel and the world population, which I'll come back to, our vaccine and antiviral drug production systems are so outdated and inadequate as to almost say, so what? Imagine today if I were to say to those one or two of you in the room who are old enough to remember, get out your slide rule and begin to calculate a whole series of complicated mathematical problems. You'd look at me and say, what? Well, think about this fact that the vaccine we use today for influenza was the same technology and is the same technology that we are currently using largely at the time that slide rules were in vogue and this vaccine was first put forward as a public health vaccine. And it hasn't changed. Slide rules have obviously moved on through many iterations to now our supercomputers. We have one slight change in that vaccine production and development change, and that's it. Otherwise, it's basically the same technology used in the 1950s. And we have a lack of medical care resources. And this isn't unique to the United States. I might add, as many woes as we have in our healthcare delivery system of this country, this is true worldwide, regardless of whether you're single payer, government sponsored, whatever, private, public. We have gnawed our healthcare system of this world down to the bone, and we're sucking calcium. And it's just that simple. We have no surge capacity. Now, if one looks at influenza viruses in general, there are 16 different what we call hemagglutinin antigens and 9 different neuraminidase antigens as part of this. There's a whole series of antigens or various structures of this virus that in composite make up the virus. These are important because there are certain cellular protein structures that are very key in the virus getting into a cell and the virus getting out of a cell. In essence, the hemagglutinin is the key that gets into a cell, whether it's a bird, whether it's a pig, or whether it's a human. And how that hemagglutinin is configured is like a key. Is it a key to an old trunk? Is it a key to a modern, sophisticated door lock? Or in fact, is it an electronic key to get you into some kind of electronic device? They're all different. In addition to that, the neuraminidase is kind of like what I would consider the equivalent of a transmission grenade. It is the ability of that virus to, in essence, get its way out of the cell once it's in it. It blows up the cell and says, here I am, I'm coming out. And without that, it's pretty much stuck inside the cell. As you'll see later, these both have very important implications for understanding, can influenza infect humans? And if once it infects humans, can then that person become capable of transmitting it to others? Now, the different hemagglutinin neuraminidase antigens also have differences within each of those 16 and 9 different combinations. If you do the math, you can see how many potential combinations we have. So, for example, human disease to date has been caused by just 3 subtypes. And I say to date, it's modern virologic history, dating back to the early 1900s, where even then we didn't have virologic technology till the 1930s, but we could go back and resurrect materials and figure out what it was. And so of the 16 hemagglutinins, only H1, 2, and 3 have been involved with human disease and only 2 different neuraminases. Within those particular hemagglutinin neuraminases, there can be many different H1s or H2s or H3. That's that reason each year we have a new vaccine, because that H1 or that H2 or that H3 can constantly be changing, kind of like a kaleidoscope. So it's now you have the right key, but imagine that those little bumps and those little knobs are constantly changing, but they still are able to fit into the right lock, but now they're changing. All known subtypes of influenza A can be found in birds, wild aquatic birds in particular. I'll come back to that. The natural history of this in animals is fascinating. But only subtypes H5 and 7 have caused severe outbreaks of disease in birds. Again, modern virologic history. Influenza goes back to antiquity. We can only guess at what it's done in the past. And when we do today look at this virus, we, like other virus agents, we can basically check the genetic makeup of this in a way that we can actually create a chronology of how old this might be and when different viruses emerged. But to date, as I said, only 5 and 7 have been thought to cause disease in birds. This is the virus. You can see the hemagglutinin neuraminidase on the outside. Imagine in your mind that this is a golf ball that I give you at the beginning of the season, and I'm not a golfer, thank God. I'd probably kill people if I were. But imagine somebody who is a kind of okay golfer, but had a tendency to hit a lot of slices and all kinds of things. But you were successful in keeping your golf ball all summer. By the end of the summer, that golf ball looked very different than it did at the beginning. There'd be a lot of cuts and nicks and all kinds of things to it. That basically is what happens as these neuraminidase and hemagglutinins are changing. And they change constantly. The amino acid sequences on these very elaborate structures are changing. The virus itself doesn't change. With those changes was what we call antigenic drift, the virus changing. So in H3N2, the current virus that we consider, whether it's A. Caledonia, A. California, whatever the virus might be, just think of those, that change is still occurring as if the golf ball is getting hit around every day and changing. When that golf ball changes from a golf ball to a lead ball, same size, now we call that antigenic shift. That's when basically a new virus emerges. And that has also major implications. As you'll see, antigenic shift is what we talk about when we think about the issue of pandemics. Now, this is the model that we currently have, kind of a framework, a classic two-dimensional model. First of all, it's of note that the influenza virus, all 16 hemagglutinins, all 9 neuraminases are found within the intestinal tract of wild aquatic birds. Very important, wild aquatic birds. All 2 qualifiers there are very important. There is no evidence that they have ever caused disease in those birds. And more importantly, we don't even have any evidence that there's been any evolution of the virus over centuries in those birds. Meaning the same kind of factory that was been pumping these viruses out for the last hundreds of years is pumping them out today. That's amazing to think that there hasn't been a lot of genetic change in the virus in the gut of those birds. What happens, though, is once that mother-lode spring gives away those viruses excreted in their feces, then it can make its way to domesticated birds, which, by the way, domesticated birds, for whatever reason, we don't know, the veterinary community can tell you about this, they are susceptible to these viruses in terms of causing disease. They can have a different kind of clinical picture than their wild aquatic bird counterparts. And I might add that we've now learned, even in Asia, to be an aquatic bird in of itself is not protective, because domesticated aquatic birds, the ducks and geese we see in the farms, are succumbing to this H5 virus in Southeast Asia, just as are the domesticated chickens, poultry, other kinds of birds. It's very interesting. Again, no evidence of death in wild aquatic birds, which is an important point. Now, I might add that there's also another animal that has played an important role, at least we think in the past, the pig. The pig is an animal for which their particular lung cells have kind of what I call a community receptor site. All comers are welcome. It will be readily infected by the wild bird type viruses, as it will be infected by human viruses. So the pig is kind of the universal mixing vessel. Basically, you get a virus in there and you can get co-infections, multiple infections. Now, it's interesting to note that, again, the data around pigs is one that we have some good evidence on, but it still is limited in only the past 100 years. Now, one of the other interesting observations about this, which as an epidemiologist tells me there might be something important about this, if you actually go back into history, wild aquatic birds likely emerged in the evolutionary tree in China. Chickens today, of which there are numbers over 460 different breeds, but we largely only know one breed today, the white chicken we produce because of its meat protein conversion capacity, all originated in China. Also of note, the pig originated in China. There's something very unusual about that area of this virus also being a hotbed in China. And I'm not going to say all things are going to come from China, but it's been a very interesting part of history. Now, the human, which should obviously have some interest to us, we think gets new influenza viruses, the new ones, not the recirculating one year after year, the one that gets the golf ball changed one. But when a new one emerges, it comes via either the poultry or the pig. We have a dotted line from the aquatic birds because we have no evidence it comes directly there. Although recently, we may have had some evidence that children, 2 children in particular in Vietnam, may have died from an encephalitis type illness that they may have actually contracted from swimming in canals with wild aquatic birds that were excreting this virus. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But so the human is very concerned about the pig or the birds. Now, you see seals and horses and other animals which we largely think are dead-end species, meaning not that they're all going to die, but they basically don't transmit it. But we don't really know. We didn't realize the important role that cats played until the Thais started feeding all their dead chickens that were dying from H5 infection to the Bengal tigers at the Bangkok Zoo. Suddenly the tigers all started dying from this very severe illness, which turned out to be influenza. Now, as we do more studies, we're realizing that felines may be uniquely susceptible to influenza virus. We never knew that. This is literally a revelation in the last year. So I don't want to paint this picture as done. We have many questions about this. Where the virus will ultimately arrive from to get to humans is still a question. But more pandemic viruses will make their way to humans. Now, to understand how that can occur, what are we talking about? Well, there are basically 2 ways that viruses could change to be a different virus from that one that's in wild aquatic birds that we don't believe can directly infect humans, at least readily, and then make their way to humans. One is a process called reassortment. The other one is one called recombination, or a culmination of point mutations. Let me describe both of those for you, because reassortment has historically been the thing we worry about with a new virus emerging causing pandemics. Tonight, I'm not sure that's the case. This is a cartoon from the New England Journal of Medicine, which shows you how an H5N1 could actually become a virus that would readily infect large numbers of humans and readily be transmitted by those humans to others. On the left side, you see a poultry with influenza A, and then one of 2 things happens. Either it can, the bottom part, it can go into a co-infected pig cell. You see the 8 genes, the different colors, 16 total genes there. That's that promiscuous, indiscrete virus I talked about. When co-infected in that pig cell, basically these things can mix and match their genes quite nicely, thank you, and come up with a new reassorted virus strain that very well will have many of the killing capabilities of the original bird virus, but now have the lock and key combination and the grenade of a human virus and work very readily. We also believe it could happen directly in a human, frankly. We have no evidence of that right now, and every time we see a secondary transmission case, we worry about that, where we see a human who begins to transmit the virus to others. And that's happened in a very limited number of occasions in Southeast Asia, and nothing sustained. That's the view of the world that has been traditionally the one we worry about. And I'll come back in a moment and show you why in the past we have proven that has been the primary mechanism by which this has happened. But I would like to point out a new, or not new, but I should say at least a new view of it. And this is one actually I've been promoting for a while, and I'm afraid, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not so sure that's going to be the case. And that's the concept of recombination, where we never have a reassortment. What happens is the genetic pressure on the virus is always there, and the virus now has enough opportunities to pass enough time between between source A to source B to source C to source D that it allows these little mutations to accumulate. So imagine a curve where, in fact, a reassortment is like the lines going along flat, and all of a sudden, whoop, up it goes in a new virus. Where a recombination is one where instead of a big change, it's just gradual, 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 and eventually it's at the same point that the new virus is at that came from reassortment. Well, how can that happen? Well, this is what we think is different. This is the numbers from my New England Journal of Medicine paper published in early May. In 1968, the last pandemic we had, and I just used China as the country. If you look at all of Southeast Asia, it's the same thing. There are 790 million people in China. 2004, it was up to 1.3 billion. There were 5.2 million pigs. Because of the Cultural Revolution and a whole new concept of personal ownership, that number went from 5.2 million to 508 million estimated pigs in 2004. And poultry, what is absolutely remarkable, there were about 12.3 million chickens on farms in China estimated in 1968. Today there are over 13 billion. Now, we have killed over 4 million chickens in China alone in the last year and a half. And today we have as many chickens in China as we had several years ago because we replenish them all the time. Southeast Asia has killed bird after bird after bird, and we have as many chickens today as we had 3 years ago because they bring them back as fast as they're killed because they need them for the protein for the food. What we have done is created the absolute perfect mixing vessel extraordinaire, well beyond just the pig, of this system right here. We are probably, on any one given day in Southeast Asia right now, passing the H5 virus from one source to another source, i.e. one bird to another bird, one bird to a pig, one pig to a pig, in one day more than we probably had the ability to transmit it in centuries in just recent history. Each time that happens, we have one more opportunity for just a little change in one amino acid to occur. And when that occurs, they accumulate over time. Today, our best guesstimate is we're 2 amino acid sequence changes away from a hemagglutinin, that H5 virus, that would be a perfect human lock and key hemagglutinin. The virus has changed dramatically from 1997 when it first emerged, and virtually none of that has occurred in humans. So the idea that we have to have this sudden reassortment, explosive kind of situation, like I pointed out, may be the old influenza. If there weren't enough people and pigs and people or poultry around, that if you didn't get the really lucky shot, if you didn't win the lottery that year, you didn't have an influenza pandemic because it just wasn't going to happen. Now, we hand out millions and millions and millions and millions of Powerball cards to you, and eventually, you're going to get something. That's what we think is happening potentially with this virus in Southeast Asia. Now, to understand pandemic influenza, you have to go back to the roots of the epidemiology and the concept of what a pandemic is to maybe distinguish it from what unfortunately has become somewhat of a confused concept. Pandemic, as it's applied to HIV and so many other diseases, is any epidemic that becomes a very widespread disease and affects a whole region, a continent, or the world. Well, frankly, we have pandemics influenza every year. Every winter season in the respective northern and southern hemispheres, and for that matter, through much of the year in the tropics, influenza causes pandemics. Influenza A hits. Remember, in January and February, we're all concerned about it, and we look to see the big increase in pneumonia deaths, etc. Well, you can say that's a pandemic. But what we're talking about here is a different kind of pandemic. It is this new strain evolving with some other additional complications. So I don't want to confuse the annual flu issue. One of the things I find quite remarkable is when you add up the overall impact of influenza every year in the world, we estimate 36 to 51,000 Americans every year die from influenza. Grant you, many of those are immunocompromised elderly people, but we have a growing proportion, which are otherwise young, healthy people, that die acutely from this. If you add those numbers up on an annual basis worldwide, we estimate that probably well over 2.5 to 3 million people die annually from influenza. When you compare that to other well-known diseases like malaria and TB, it fares very well against them, unfortunately. So we just don't think about that. So I don't want to ever minimize intra-pandemic problems. They're there. But the one I'm really concerned about here is the Lion King. It's this pandemic difference. At least 10 pandemics have been recorded in the last 300 years. In 1918 and 1920, at least 50 million to 100 million deaths occurred worldwide. And what's very important about that is that number has been so lowballed because it's become tradition to say what somebody said before. It's interesting to note that McFarland Burnett, a very famous epidemiologist, had calculated the number to be close to 100 million back in the 1930s. Everybody forgot that. Well, a group of historians recently went back and did a very, very comprehensive, wonderful country-by-country look at the mortality in 1918 and 1919 and published this. Again, the reference is in my New England Journal paper. So I would tell you that, I believe in 1918, when the world population, by the way, was 1.8 billion, quite a bit smaller than it is today, that was 100 million people that died. Now, at least you think that was an anomaly, that somehow it was so different that it won't happen again. Actually, John Barry and I, John's a historian who wrote one of the famous books on influenza, which I'll show you in a moment, are actually going back right now and resurrecting the 1830 to 32 pandemic. And if you look at the actual mortality in that, it actually was higher than it was in 1918. So there can be pandemics that can be really, really bad. There can be pandemics that are bad, and some that are frankly, so what? When pandemics occur, it has to have the following three characteristics. It needs a novel influenza strain emerging that basically first can be readily transmitted between humans. So you got to have that hemagglutinin neuraminidase matchup. You have to have a genetically unique type, basically meaning that we don't all have antibody to it. Or it has to be unique in the sense, and there's a misconception about this, it has to be a brand new virus. Not true. This could be a virus that circulated 100 years ago and comes back, but who has protective antibody? Or even for that matter, 60 years ago. At the very most, only those 60 or older would have some protective antibody yet around, if in fact they had any at all. But it has to be unique relative to most of the population. And then finally, what really determines the pandemic's overall impact is, does it have an increased virulence? Or the relationship of the agent and the host. Is this a bad matchup? And as you'll see, not all influenza viruses are created equal in the eyes of the infectious disease gods. They're very different. Pandemics have differed in terms of their population-specific mortality rates and cannot be characterized by a single risk predictive model. I really find it difficult when we see somebody come up with some model about influenza pandemics and say this is what will happen. There's a whole lot of rationale or reasoning that has to go into that and say, why might this be like this one? And I think tonight it's very fair to ask me, why might this one be like 1918 if I think that's going to be the case versus a 57 or a 68 one? And we'll talk about that. If one looks at the three pandemics of the last century in the world, the 1918-19, and I might add that actually went on to this last wave, was the spring of 1920, a much smaller wave. And there, all the hemagglutinin neuraminases were novel. At least 500,000 excess deaths occurred in this country. And I just show you that to compare the data for the other two pandemics in this country so you get a relative sense. The 1957-58 one had basically a novel hemagglutinin neuraminidase, but we're not sure just the impact of that in the sense of the virulence factor, which I'll share with you in a minute. And then finally, the 68-69 had only a new hemagglutinin. And there you had 60 and 40,000 excess deaths, respectively, in a growing U.S. population, by the way. So those numbers aren't just smaller. If you did that to a rate, they'd be substantially smaller. So you can see there's a big difference between these three different pandemics. Now, in the 1918-19 pandemic, it unfortunately received the name Spanish flu, which was an absolute misnomer. As you may recall, in 1918-19, we were actually in a world war. And at that time, anyone who was involved with that war basically had an embargo on in their country of talking about anything that might give the enemy some advantageous information. And so this basically blackout of news around this was true throughout most of Europe, with one exception, Spain. Spain was a neutral country in World War I and readily reported on it and talked about the people literally almost dying in the streets in Madrid. So everybody labeled it the Spanish flu. There's no evidence at all it occurred there. And in fact, ironically, the first major hit of influenza in Europe, and actually even before the major hit in the United States, occurred in Switzerland. Nobody cared about Switzerland at the time. Over 200 million to a billion people were infected, more than 50 to 100 million died. As I'll show you later, that had a very different epidemiologic pattern. It had what we call a W curve, or imagine a mortality curve with the rate of mortality on the x-axis, y-axis, basically you have a situation where you have the age. And what you have here is you'll see that, in fact, the very young had a slightly increased mortality rate, and then it actually dips down even more so until it hits the early 20s, and then basically it takes off. And the W, the middle part of the W, is by far much higher. It comes back down by the 40s, and only towards the 60 years of life do you see it go up a little bit again. Very different. The typical mortality curve we see with influenza is a typical U-shaped curve. Highest in young, decreasing, and then highest again in elderly. All the other pandemics of the 20th century were U-shaped curves that just basically had a tide come in and raise it all up. So it was like, tides raise all boats. Basically what happened, it all went up. This was different than 1918. Also, another clue as to what was going on was evident in the studies of the impact of H5N1 or on H1N1 on pregnant women. In a summary of 13 studies conducted in 6 different countries involving pregnant women, the case fatality ranged from 23 to 71%, with a median of 55% of all pregnant women died from influenza during this pandemic. Now, what that's telling us is pregnancy in of itself is one of the most unique immunologic events that can occur in a human body. Basically, part of something inside of you shouldn't be there because it's not you. So you're trying to get rid of it. Another part of you does everything to protect that thing from both yourself and from any foreign hit that might come in and try to do it damage. And it's a constant immunologic struggle, basically, a concept called pregnancy. This virus, in that state, caused a very amazing outcome. And it wasn't unique, as I said, to socioeconomic status. It wasn't unique to race. This was a very prominent finding. Now, we think we have a better understanding of what went on there in work that's been done in modern times. For example, Kabasin group from Wisconsin, together with Jeff Taubenberger and the group at the Armed Forces Research or Pathology Research Institute, as well as colleagues at Health Canada's BSL-4 lab in Winnipeg. For those that don't know, like our CDC's in Atlanta, Health Canada's primary infectious disease laboratories in Winnipeg. It's the state-of-the-art facility for the world. And they did studies where basically they took the gene sequences that Jeff Taubenberger and colleagues at the Armed Forces Pathology Institute had determined to be those gene sequences for the 1918 virus. They were obtained by going back just literally 8 years ago and pulling out pathology slides for patients who had died in 1918 and trying to extract out the genetic material on those slides. It was only possible to be done now with the modern technology. In addition to that, a Swedish researcher who actually did his PhD in epidemiology at the University of Iowa, and I say epidemiology at the time was called community health, but he was an epidemiologist, actually got very involved with this back in the 1950s. And he actually went to Alaska to try to exhume bodies of Inuits that were killed from pandemic influenza in 1918. One particular village, Breivik Mission, where 70% of the residents died in a 10-day period. And because this was in the permafrost in the fall, they actually buried him somewhat in the permafrost, and hopefully it was thought that there may be this semi-preservation of the bodies. And he went up in the 50s to try to exhume them, and which he got permission, he did, and he could never recover any live virus. Thank God he probably couldn't, because I'm not sure in the 50s we were aware of this. But literally just 7 years ago, he contacted Jeff Taubenberger as he was doing this other work and said, if you need more material, I think I know where we can get it. That crew then went back to Breivik Mission. They actually were able to exhume more bodies. One particular woman, a more obese woman, who happened to be fairly well preserved in the lungs. While, again, they didn't grow out live virus, they got good genetic material from her lung cells. And now we've completed sequencing 7 of the 8 genes. The 8th one's just about done, but we've sequenced the most important ones, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase. Well, based on that, Kabas's group in Wisconsin took those genes and actually inserted them. And this is a controversial study, to say the least, one I think is very important, and it was done very well under very, very tight security, and actually put those into regular H1N1 strains that still we have around, that were lab animals that are pretty benign. You put it in ferrets and, they get a little mild illness. Well, lo and behold, when he put the hemagglutinin gene in, and hemagglutinin only, these animals had the most incredible illness you could imagine, which was basically characterized as this massive cytokine production the chemical in the body that is in essence the smoke alarm to the immune system to respond, along with this macrophage activity. And they basically developed this massive organ damage due to what we call a cytokine storm. They went on and developed a classic we call acute respiratory distress syndrome in humans, which in these lab animals. When you look at the pathology of these animals, and you look at the pathology of the humans that died in 1918, there was no difference. Well, in work that Malik Paris did in Hong Kong, Malik was a very famous person in the whole SARS situation, having done much of the work there. He was also involved in the 1997 original H5 emergence in Hong Kong, someone who we're doing a lot of work with right now. And Malik's group actually has seen a number of these patients or has had materials from H5 patients. And it's very, very frightening in that the clinical picture of patients right now coming out of the Southeast Asian H5N1 experience look very similar to the 1918 patients with a classic cytokine storm type picture. When you actually take the viral isolates, they do the very same thing in terms of the cytokine storm. The gene has now been sequenced on this H5N1, and it's a moving gene, the hemagglutinin gene, but it is basically a deja vu all over again for 1918. Such is my basis for saying there's a very legitimate concern to think that 1918 and 2005 could have dramatic similarities. This is a cartoon actually from my New England Journal paper last month in which I show what a cytokine storm looks like and what happens. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, the H5N1 influenza virus attaches to the epithelial cells of the lung. At that point, basically, they can elicit cytokines in a number of different ways, and they do it all the ways. First, you can have the chemoattractants, pro-inflammatory cytokines that directly come from that interaction. That's on the left side. You then have a macrophage processing this H5N1. It induces, together with a T cell combination, this activated T cell that is highly activated, puts out exorbitant amounts of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And then you basically have just a regular activated macrophage that does the same thing. Together, this would be the equivalent, as I've told the class, imagine if we had a wastebasket up here and somebody put a newspaper and started it on fire and the smoke alarm went off in this room. It makes sense. Now imagine if that same event set off every smoke alarm in the state of Minnesota. That's what this virus does. It basically sets them all off. The body comes in, attacks itself, and so the very severe damage to the lung, and for this matter, kidneys and liver, actually occur as a result of this highly excitable and uncontrolled exuberant cytokine response. And that's exactly what we're seeing. I only tell you this because, frankly, folks, we don't have a hell of a lot better way of handling patients with this type of crashing clinical condition today than we did in 1918. That also leads us to believe that 1918 and 2005 may not be all that different. Now, if one looks at the 1957-58 pandemic, the H2N2 strain, different than H1N1. Pandemic strain acquired 3 genes from the avian influenza gene pool in wild ducks by genetic reassortment and obtained 5 other genes from the circulating human strain. Aha, reassortment, it worked. Somehow these two got together indiscriminately. Waloo, we got this virus. Confirms reassortment's important. Well, the same thing happened in 1968-69. H3N2 now is the circulating strain. 2 genes from the duck reservoir, 6 genes from humans virus. Again, it happened. I might add, for those who are not familiar with influenza epidemiology, we have no idea why this happens. I can't find anybody who can explain it to me. But every time a new pandemic strain emerges, it somehow causes the previous pandemic strain, which has now basically become attenuated but circulates annually, to disappear. So H1N1 basically virtually disappeared in 1957 when the new strain emerged. Then that H2N2 disappeared in 68 when the H3N2 emerged, and that's the one that's still around. And it's just a sideline note, again, somebody, Mother Nature knows what's going on, but we don't. Now, this is a letter, I think, that really sets into context the 1918 pandemic, and one that every time I read it, I still am taken aback by it. This is a letter from Dr. Roy Grist, who was one of the camp surgeons, or camp physicians, they called them surgeons at the time, outside of Boston, taking care of the trainees in the United States on their way to the European theater. He wrote this letter to his dear friend Bert in 1918, Bert's family actually found it in a trunk in his attic in the late 1970s and submitted it to the British Medical Journal, which then published it. So it was actually written in the heat of pandemic flu in 1918. And it goes on to say, these men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe, of influenza. And when brought to hospital, they rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. And a few hours later, you can begin to see cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours and then until death comes. It is horrible. One can stand to see 1 or 2 or 20 men die, but to see those poor devils dropping like flies. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day. Pneumonia means in about all cases death. We have lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days, there were no coffins and the bodies piled up something fierce. It beats any sight they'd ever seen in France after a battle. An extra long barracks has been vacated for the use of the morgue, and it would make any man sit up and take notice to walk down the long lines of dead soldiers, all dressed and laid out in double rows. Goodbye, old pal. God be with you till we meet again. Roy Grist died 6 months later from influenza. Several points to note here. These patients died very quickly, literally within hours to several days, which is not typical of secondary bacterial pneumonia associated with influenza, or for that matter, primary viral pneumonitis associated with influenza. Again, much more in keeping with this cytokine-type storm picture. This is a book by Dr. Al Crosby, a historian from the University of Texas at Austin. A very good book written almost 15 years ago. A new edition is out. I know Dr. Crosby. He's a very colorful character, must be in his 80s now, and I swear to God he can tell a story better than anybody I've ever met. This is a book by John Barry. I mentioned earlier the person we're doing work with. Also very famous for having written the book Rising Tide, the story of the floods in New Orleans, which won him many, many awards. This book should. It really is by far the most in-depth and scholarly piece on the overall issue of influenza in 1918, and one that the general public obviously has some interest in. I just talked to John this morning, and as of today, this book has now been on the extended bestseller list of the New York Times for the last 6 months, so somebody's starting to pay some attention. And then finally, this is a book by Gina Collada, the New York Times medical reporter, Flu, the story of the great influenza pandemic of 1918 and the search for the virus that caused it. This really chronicles the work that Jeff Taubenberger did, and when I mentioned about the Breivik mission and so forth, it's really quite a fascinating read to see. This is what the camp morgues and hospitals look like. If you go back and as a student of history and understand how World War I was fought and the implications thereof, one cannot miss the incredible impact that influenza had. There are many, many battles in which the highest number of patients sick or dying actually were attributed to influenza and not to anything on the battlefield. One of the most famous battles of World War I was that battle over a very key tunnel going under the French Alps, in which the Allied troops were basically outmanned and poorly prepared to take, but had been ordered to attempt to do so. And it just so happened that the German army, unfortunately in their eyes at least, succumbed to what they called the Spanish flu the week before the battle, and the Allied troops literally walked right through the tunnel. There were many such situations. This is actually a battlefield scene from Luxembourg, where at one time there were about 15 people hospitalized or being cared for by medics for influenza for every battlefield-associated wound or serious injury. It gives you a sense of the impact this disease had. These are data which I think really, really helps illustrate the kind of importance of influenza and how it was so different. These are actually data from Boston City and the Public Health Agency there. And what you can see here is the percent of deaths on the left side there, and it gives you the months of September, October, and November for 1918. Now, as an epidemiologist, I have to point out these are not rates in the sense of basically looking at age-specific mortality. But what you see here is this big peak in those 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and 30 to 39 years of age, which was very unusual. This was the heat or the highest time for the pandemic in Boston area. This slide, however, tells it all. The top graph is actually the historic data from 1912 to 1916 for the age distribution of deaths from influenza and pneumonia in the city of Boston. On that nav bar, on the left axis there, you see 0, 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. Below, you see 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49. You can see by far 50 to 59, 60 to 69 is where you see the highest rates. The second graph is September to October of 1918. And now, instead of being rates per 100, 200, 300, those rates are 1,000, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, even 5,700, which was the top rate, by the way, I might add, for those who were in the 20 to 29 years age group. That's remarkable what that did. Absolutely remarkable. That was what we saw traditionally throughout much of the world. If we take those same 1918 rates, and I've tried to make the case that maybe it might be deja vu all over again, you can see in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, to give you some sense of this, the equivalent 1918 to 20 rate here in deaths would be about 18,538 deaths here. In Minnesota, it would be about 30,000 deaths. HIV/AIDS has killed less than 4,000 people in the state from the last 20 years. United States, 1.7 million deaths, and worldwide, if you take even the most conservative, mildest pandemic, 30 million, but clearly up to 384 million, adjusting for what is now the very different world population. HIV/AIDS worldwide has killed 26 million people to date in 25 years. Again, a perspective piece. If you look at the age population and the age-adjusted rates for today's population and the 1918 population rates, you can see that from 15 to 44 years of age, you're talking about a good chunk of people. We have nothing comparable to that in our country except for 1918. Even all the wars, etc., HIV/AIDS, nothing has ever done that. Now, could it do it again? Could it be like that? Well, this is the experience we base it on right now. This H5N1 influenza in Asia started in 1997 in the Hong Kong area in the Guangdong province, in which very few cases at that time occurred in humans. Birds were killed, millions of birds, and we thought maybe we dodged a bullet. Well, the virus came back. It continued to emerge from 1997 right up till 2004, where again it raised its ugly head. And in the late 2003, 2004, and now 2004, 2005 seasons, we've had 17 human cases, 12 deaths in Thailand, 76 human cases, 37 deaths in Vietnam, and 4 human cases and 4 deaths in Cambodia. I would tell you this hardly represents the real number. How much different, we don't know, but we've missed cases. Second of all, I'm not sure that this case fatality rate, if you add this all up, which looks pretty damn scary, is going to be the right one, because I think we've missed a number of milder infections, so I believe it's really lower than this. But it still could very easily rival a 5% case fatality rate we saw in 1918. Many of these patients, particularly in Vietnam and Thailand, had access to high-quality health care. It wasn't that this was some remote area. Frankly, right now, some of the most amazing hospitals in the world are in the Far East. I just came back from Seoul, Korea, where I have to tell you, having been in the Samsung Medical Center, and traveling with me was Walt Wilson, one of my colleagues from the Mayo Clinic, he would acknowledge the Mayo Clinic looks like a country practice compared to what they have at the Samsung Medical Center. It makes anything technology-wise, building-wise, etc. in this country look second class. We sometimes have this egocentric view of if it was in the United States, it wouldn't be like this. Well, I don't want you to tell you all Vietnam and Thailand are great medical practice. Many of these patients had early access to high-quality health care and still crashed and burned. Now, you can see how widespread the virus is in terms of the bird population. It's amazing, and it continues. And what's happening is it's a seasonal situation yet, where the fall, early winter, and then goes into spring. Each year for the last 3 years, the bird cases have come earlier, more of them, and have lasted longer. Now, as you know, we're just right now in the throes of a very large migratory bird, non-aquatic birds, by the way, migratory bird die-off in China, which has been largely covered up. We still have major problems in poultry. 4 weeks ago, we just found that pigs are widespread infection in Indonesia, and this thing just keeps growing. Every one of those is a transmission potential for one more point mutation to occur, and this virus has continued to emerge. In a WHO visitation that was held in early May, which has been published, it's on our website, I'll give you that in a moment, that address, You can go read it. You can see we're even beginning to see emergence of different viruses as such within the different countries. And we're following the amino acid sequence changes on the hemagglutinin, and they just keep getting closer and closer and closer to winning bingo. That's very scary. Now, I talk about this at length in the New England Journal piece. It was in May. Are we prepared or not prepared? And largely the answer is no. 2 weeks ago, Nature actually ran an entire series on this. One whole issue is pandemic influenza. I had an article in there about what we need to do. Tonight I'll talk a little bit about that, but for the sake of time I can't. I don't want you to think I'm going to get up here and tell you it's all bad. There are things we can and must do, and I'll share those with you in a moment. This piece there, probably the piece that I think is, for this group, probably the best read is yet to come. This is coming out in 2 weeks in Foreign Affairs, Preparing for the Next Pandemic. This is a much more extensive paper. It's about 10,000 words as opposed to the other ones that are about 1,500 words, and I have a little bit more opportunity to get into what are the issues we need. The basic timeline for me is what happens if it happens tonight? What would we do? We'd close our borders right away. I have no doubt about that. Having been in government as long as I have been in Washington and seen it, I mean, we have no other choice. Everybody in the world will shut down. Look what SARS did, and I actually analyzed the SARS experience here. That would mean we're all on our own. We'll have no vaccine. I'll talk about that in a moment. If it happened a year from now, what would we do? And if for some amazing miracle reason it doesn't happen for 10 years, it's going to happen, what do we do? Now, let me just clear one point right up from the get-go here. Is it going to happen? Absolutely. Unless you tell me how we can stop hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic activity, and Minnesota blizzards, it will happen. It's Mother Nature. We have no reason to think it'll ever stop for any reason. This natural evolution is going to occur. The best we can do is try to interface with it at the immunologic level and say, okay, virus, you spin out of those birds, but we're going to be protected. And this is how we're going to do it. Right now, again, we're 1950s deja vu all over again. Now, if one looks at influenza pandemic preparedness, you can basically look at it in 3 different areas: prevention, treatment, collateral damage response. Prevention is obviously vaccines and antivirals. Treatment is healthcare delivery system. Collateral damage is the whole economy and everything else that's part of that economy. Let me go through these. Vaccination, antiviral therapy. If we look at vaccination, as I mentioned already, we're using the 1950s technology, grown in chicken eggs. It takes about 6 months or more to produce. It does use reverse genetics. It's the one new twist where we can actually go in and select out parts of the virus we want to be in this growing in this chicken egg that doesn't kill the chicken egg itself. And we keep in the other parts of it that are important from an immunogenicity standpoint. The problem with it's patented technology owned by one group, and we haven't seen anybody willing to use this yet unless it's given to them by WHO, which for proprietary reasons and intellectual property isn't going to be available. As such, it's a problem. I won't go any more than that. We have a recent approval of a live attenuated vaccine, still grown in chicken eggs. The MedImmune vaccine, which is a great vaccine, has all the same problems of production. We need an immediate and comprehensive international program to develop a cell culture for vaccine production with surge capacity. What am I talking about? Well, if you look at this vaccine, this is how it's currently produced. Another cartoon from the England Journal of Medicine. On the left, you have the months. And you can see there in January, we take a look at what is happening with the previous summer and fall in the southern hemisphere, for example, where they do the reverse of us in terms of our winter. And what at that point, WHO makes a selection for the next year's vaccine, already in winter of the previous year. And then it goes into this long, laborious process in March and April of being put into chicken eggs. Seed pools are then expanded and inoculated. And then it takes months to grow that. Finally, by July, it is now taken out, purified, and that's where the Chiron vaccine got in trouble. It got contaminated in the purification step with the bacteria, couldn't be used. Well, you don't get a vaccine until September. You know what? A pandemic strain is not going to be any different. Today, we can produce vaccine that are H5N1 strains that are the current ones, but we know it's changing. Remember, just like we change vaccine every year, now it doesn't mean we might not have some protection right now if you used H5N1, the current strain, but basically we would largely wait for the new pandemic strain to emerge. So already, our race doesn't start till basically the pandemic's already on track. Now, this is the problem with the vaccine crisis. Currently, international capacity for influenza vaccine production using egg culture is approximately 300 million trivalent or 900 million monovalent doses. Today, when you get an influenza shot, you get basically two influenza A strains and one influenza B strain. We could cut that all out and say we're just going to go with the one, H5N1, if that be it. Now, the problem with that is, even though you can get 900 million monovalent strain or doses out of that, is we know it's going to take at least 2 shots to get any kind of production because it's such a new novel strain, and we're having a real problem getting it to work anyway. So right now you have 500 million doses that wouldn't be available for at least 6 months after the pandemic begins. That's about 14% of the world's population would have access to it. But that's not the whole story, because you can say, well, just increase production. It turns out this is all we have. The pipes are there. That's it. Today, to build a new manufacturing plant for any pharmaceutical, including vaccine, even if you crash it, is 4 to 5 years. The premier company in the world that makes most of the equipment to fill vaccine vials or whatever is actually right here in Plymouth, Minnesota. And I can tell you, we've met many times with them. They can't rush any faster because this all has to be finally made, etc. It's a really very complicated process. Also, almost all the world's influenza vaccines produced in just 9 countries, 12% of the world's population. As soon as this pandemic hits, we'll nationalize every dose of this. The U.S. is going to have a very limited amount because over half of our current vaccine comes from outside the United States. On top of that, we're not going to increase production at all in the next several years. Why? Because no industry group is going to invest in this because they know cell culture is coming. Cell culture is going to be a better way to make it. It's going to be more efficient, potentially a bit faster, and clearly a scalable situation that eggs aren't right now. So why invest? Imagine, for a couple of you too young in the room, I'll explain later what a 78 record is, but imagine an old 78 record, and I said, let's build a new plant for that, and you look at me and say, why? We're using DVDs. All the pharmaceutical companies have said, we're going to wait till cell culture. You get the technology down, you tell us how to do it, you get the approvals, and then we'll build. So we basically are in a black hole right now. We will not see more vaccine production for some time to come. And then finally, we need a new and more timely method of production, absolutely, and making it a lot better. What ideally we could do one day is actually go in and actually take parts of the virus that are conserved, or meaning they're not changing all the time, and make the vaccine to those antigens so that we could have a generic influenza vaccine that could cover many hemagglutinins, many neuraminases, and so what if it nicks its outside coat a bit? We could still cover them. But you know what? We have invested virtually no resources into influenza vaccine research for the last 50 years. If we had a Manhattan Project today, we could do that. I got in big trouble 20 years ago when I challenged Margaret Heckler, the then Secretary of Health and Human Services, in the front page of the New York Times the day after she announced the discovery of the HIV virus and the fact that we'd have a vaccine within 3 years. And I said, hey, I don't think we'll see it in my lifetime. And of course, just another naysayer, we're optimistic, because we had no idea immunologically how to protect a host against the Trojan virus genome of the HIV when it goes from donor A to recipient B. We still don't. And I think I will probably go to my grave. I hope not, but I'm feared desperately we won't have an AIDS vaccine. That's not true with influenza. We know so much about the immunology of it, even in our most fundamental and crude way. We could do what I'm talking about. It's just we haven't had the will to do it. Current vaccine efforts are a problem. NIH basically is making candidate vaccines in a research setting. There's clinical trials going on right now just to look at immunogenicity. We should be looking at a thing called antigen sparing. What if we had X number of doses? Could we make that X times 5? If, in fact, instead of using a full dose intramuscularly, we use part of a dose intradermally. That research hasn't even started yet, which frosts me to no end. Recent H5N1 isolates have 10 amino acid sequence changes from just the earlier isolates that we were working with. They also have some very unique antigenic properties that have made it very hard to get good antibody. And I'm not going to go into the whole issue of affinity and avidity of influenza antibodies, but it's tough. And that's why we have seen very poor immunogenicity even with the vaccines we're working with now. Now remember, this is not going to be the ultimate vaccine. It's kind of a practice prototype one for H5N1, but even already we're still having problems with it. So vaccine will not be there those first months, guys. How about antiviral drugs? Well, basically, the M2 protein inhibitors, imantidine or amantine, are out already because such high resistance. Most strains are resistant to this. As I mentioned in my class, there's a paper coming out in the New England Journal of Medicine shortly showing that the Chinese, for God knows whatever reason, I mean, I know why, but it was very unfortunate. For the last 5 years or more, have been putting amantadine in the water of all their chicken farms, and now we're reporting about 75% of all influenza isolates coming out of the Far East are resistant to amantadine. We lost that drug in essence. But we do have the selective neuraminidase inhibitors. And what's very important here is that there are 2 such licensed products. It's the only things in the pipeline. One's an Amamir, which is virtually not available. It's an inhalant type material, hard to produce. The other one is oseltamivir phosphate or Tamiflu. It too is not a panacea. In fact, I worry desperately we're trying to find one and have made it as such. 2 things. One is, can you treat patients with it? We don't know. Some of the patients in Southeast Asia received this drug early in the course of their illness, and it did not change the course. We don't know what impact this will have. There are a series of papers that have been published on cytokine storm issues in this, and I'm part of a group right now evaluating that issue, but I got to tell you, we're not sure it'll work. Second of all, maybe you could give it in a sense of an early outbreak to stop it from moving. There's, in fact, a whole series of papers that have come out recently, particularly in the media, they're talking about it, about the idea of early intervention. And it's all based on modeling. And you know what? I know I'll get myself in trouble here tonight, but in my 30 years in public health, I have never seen a modeler help us in public health once with anything that was meaningful in intervention methodology. I just haven't seen it. You give me an example. I've been on the front lines of many of these diseases, and I've yet to see a modeling example that helped us. Well, they've modeled to say if you get into Asia quickly around an emerging situation, you could give prophylaxis or antivirals to all these groups. None of them have ever been on the front lines of public health. Right now, we're taking days to get this stuff in. We're getting, even the patients that get sick and get them in there, we don't know they have, even though they're being treated early on as if they have H5, we don't confirm H5 until sometime 7 to 10 days later. I mean, I can go through the whole laundry list why this will never work. It just is not practical. But the bottom line why it won't work is there's a single plant in the world that makes this stuff. Hoffmann-La Roche, or Roche Pharmaceuticals, has one plant outside of Basel, Switzerland. It has a production capability of 100 million treatment doses a year. That's it for the whole world. It has a primary precursor chemical, which cannot be synthesized in Switzerland. It comes from China. Global trade shuts down. It's down. And it takes more than 6 months to make the stuff. Right now, they have orders that are back-ordered, even though countries claim, like Britain and Canada, that they've got all this stuff. It's all in order. None of it's been delivered, or most of it's not been delivered. It's just not there. They're building a new plant in the United States, which will be up later this year. Same problem. It's not going to really increase it. At most, this will nibble at 1% of the world's population at best. So antivirals right now, I don't see them having any big impact on this. How about treatment? Facilities and staffing. When this global just-in-time economy goes down, which it will, we'll shut the borders down. There are 2 companies in the world that make N95 masks, the respirator masks that we need to use. They have virtually no surge capacity. Most of them are running right now at 95% capacity. Their plants are outside the United States largely, and most of their component pieces come from 3rd and 4th countries. We'll run an N95 mask within a week. We did that with SARS. They got backed up even with SARS being very limited in Asia, parts of Asia, and just Canada. Well, who are you going to get to go work somewhere, no vaccine, no antivirals, and no masks? And we've done nothing to plan for that or consider that. The psychological implications, the actual workforce implications, and what that means. In addition, given the fact that most of our large metropolitan area cities, or hospitals in our cities, every winter go on diversion status in their emergency rooms when we have a slight increase in flu, says, you know what? We don't have any surge capacity in these institutions. We're going to have to open up gymnasiums, community centers, etc., even for a relatively mild pandemic. Medical devices and therapy. In my New England Journal paper, I detail the fact that we only have 105,000 mechanical ventilators in this country. On any one given day, 70,000 to 80,000 are in use just for routine medical care, etc. During the flu season, we bump right up to 100,000 plus, and we begin to actually move mechanical ventilators around by overnight express delivery because of the need for them. There's a single company that makes these basically in Germany. We've been trying to get them post 9/11. I was very involved with that, trying to just build up a strategic stockpile. By the way, that 105 includes our national strategic stockpile. So just to give you a sense, that tells you how many are in the stockpile. And the point being is, if you don't have mechanical ventilation, you don't really have drugs as such, what are you going to do? Other therapies. The pharmaceutical industry of this world will crash. It will crash. Why? Because today, most of our drugs do come from overseas, or component precursors come from overseas. We have 8 antibiotics right now that are in short supply in this country. Go to look at the American College of Healthcare Pharmacists website. And it's because we have one plant with just-in-time delivery with one little slight perturbation, and it's down. When we stop global trade and travel, we're going to see all the medications that you typically think of for chronic disease care going out the window. We currently have 2 major pediatric oncology drugs that right now are being rationed in this country because there are not enough of them to go around, and oncologists are beside themselves. Well, screw that. We're going to have virtually limited oncology drugs for everybody when this happens. There has been no contingency plans made for any of this. Ethical issue, who gets what for what? Who does get any antivirals if they're available? Who gets the first doses of vaccine when it becomes available at 6 months? Things we haven't addressed at all. How are we going to use recovered volunteers? You know what? The healthcare workers are going to go down quick. If they don't have masks, they don't have antivirals at work, or they just don't have them, and they don't have vaccine, I mean, if they do go to work, they're going to be like Roy Grist. They're going to be at the very highest risk of contracting and likely dying of this infection. Remember, who's most of our healthcare workforce today? 20 to 40-year-olds. I mean, they couldn't be at a worse age group if the cytokine storm, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, in Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia, who's dying of this? 20 to 40-year-olds. Sound familiar? So the point being is that when you look at this issue, we're going to need to get volunteers in there. But today, can you imagine staffing a hospital with community volunteers, a truck driver who was covered, who's lost family members, so wants to help? You know, between our professional liability and professional hubris, I don't think, are we going to allow that? Do we have any plans for that? Have we thought about that? How would we do it? And then finally, corpse management. I was in Chicago in 1995 for the heat-related outbreak of deaths there. There were 7 refrigerated semis sitting outside the Chicago morgue because they couldn't process bodies fast enough. And if you want to see a psychologically chilling sight, I wish you could have seen that. Well, today, the average casket from the time it's made till it's in the ground is 3.5 weeks. In 1969, that was almost 6 months. Today, many of the parts in a casket come from Asia. We'll run out of caskets overnight. We have no surge capacity. Our crematoriums will be extremely limited, both by actual space, but by staffing, because that staffing, they're not prepared to gear up like that. We have no plans for corpse management. In 1918, they actually buried bodies in big, big holes. Things that you didn't see many pictures of, but it was no different than some of the worst sights you saw in World War II. Again, we have not done virtually nothing to plan for that. How about the collateral damage? The implication of the global just-in-time economy. I already talked about other pharmaceutical products. Our food supply will go to hell in a handbasket quickly. Today, the just-in-time delivery is just as evident there as it is anywhere else. The average institutional setting has less than 2 days of food on hand. Hospitals, everybody. The average grocery store gets food in every day. The single largest wholesaler of grocery items in the world is right here in Minneapolis in Super Value. They are the major #1 wholesale distributor in the United States. They, on average, have 2 to 3 days inventory in their warehouses. Everything today is just-in-time delivery. I know this very well from bioterrorism, because you think of ice cream, which used to be made and would be stored in freezers and taken out over days and weeks. Today, premium ice cream, from the time that it's actually put in the carton until it's on the shelf, is 12 hours. It's amazing. Just-in-time inventory. Used to be when corn was harvested in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, where the green giant lives. Basically, they'd harvest it in July. They had these huge warehouses where all these cans would sit, and every day, every week, for the next 12 months, they'd pull out more and more cans and distribute them. Today, that's all distributed in one day. And the next day, it comes from another place. And the next day, it comes from another place. And many of them are Honduras. Many of them are Costa Rica. Any number of places around the world. Every day that happens, that'll shut down immediately. So even non-perishable items will disappear. We've made no plans for that whatsoever. None. We will run out of food. Imagine how we all respond when we have a blizzard. Everybody runs to the grocery store, gets everything they can, and store shelves go bare. But as soon as the blizzard's over, it'll be stocked back up. Now that's going to last for months and months and months and months, and it's going to happen over the whole country. The reason they can restock those shelves as well as they do 2 to 3 days later is because they don't have the pull from all the other locations around the country, and so they can siphon off some inventory. We won't have that ability. Again, we haven't thought about it. Equipment parts. Most of the municipal wells in this country use a pump that is made by a single European country, a company in a European country, where if that part goes bad, they literally ship it in overnight by airplane. That's how everything's run that way today. That will absolutely stop. In Japan, 2 years ago, they had a fire at a brake factory. One brake factory that makes brakes for cars. Within 4 hours, all 3 major manufacturers had to shut down their lines because they had no brakes to put in their cars. They hadn't thought about that yet. I mean, you'd think that's pretty obvious, right? Well, so all of this issue, and I talk about that a lot in my foreign affairs piece, the financial and the actual implications are huge. You don't realize how many things, do you know how many light bulbs are made in this country? Virtually none. We won't have light bulbs. So part of what we have to do is start thinking through the supply chain issues of what are the key supply chain issues we got to meet. What are we going to do to meet them? Forget electronics. Best Buy might as well wrap up its doors and go away. I really believe this. We got to find a way to figure out what are the things that are critical to get through 12 to 18 months of a pandemic and do it, and we haven't done it yet. And finally, international security. I must say international security is huge. The world will be in utter chaos. I just participated in a CIA tabletop exercise on flu, and I got to tell you, it scares the hell out of them. Now, you can argue intelligence today is a counterintuitive term in Washington, but in fact, they see the handwriting on the wall, what happened if flu were to occur. So what do? Well, we have a lack of national and international plans. I comment heavy about that in the nature piece and really go at it in the foreign affairs piece. We need granularity in these plans. We need somebody at the highest level to say this is critical. This has to be the G8. The G8 meets next month. We're trying to get this on the agenda. It's on the agenda right now, but it's buried down so far, it'd take a microscope to find it. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the single biggest risk to the world today as we know it. Because when we shut down that global economy, forget all the deaths, which will be apparent, all the collateral damage. It'll be amazing. We have no coordinated vaccine research, development, or procurement strategy. We have a country-by-country approach. Today, the United States is the only country that's invested even minimal amounts of money in research. Canada, which is very proud of its effort in flu, is still fighting over funding its vaccine research initiative, is now going into its 17th month of waiting for funding. Nothing's been done in Canada. Same things over and over again. Incremental increase in antiviral drug research, development, and procurement strategy, we need that. I talk more about that. Preliminary medical care, public health system plans. We need, how the hell are we going to operate these things if it's even a mild pandemic? What are we going to do? And, public health, and I come from that world, my colleagues there, I have the greatest respect for them, and thank God Minnesota led the way when we had the last year's fall vaccine shortage that occurred because Chiron couldn't deliver a vaccine. But we got caught with our pants down. We should have anticipated as a country that one day we might not get all the vaccine we had anticipated, and we were caught by surprise. Minnesota made it up as they went, and the rest of the nation ended up following, and I'm very proud of them for that. But the same thing is true for many of these other plans. We don't have plans. I talked to a very major managed care organization in this country who happens to be for-profit, and they don't want to talk about it because if the street hears about this, they're screwed, meaning Wall Street. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's no excuse because they're going to be right in the front of it. We got to get that. And finally, how are we going to secure necessary resources to survive 12 to 18 months of thing? I'm just curious because I know a lot about the food system. I know a lot about it. I can't figure out how we're going to do it. But the bottom line is industry hasn't had one single meeting on this yet to even think about it, even though we've been prodding them to try to do that. So what do? Well, we pray, plan, and practice, and I think, frankly, it's in that order. I make the comment in my foreign affairs piece that, just having a plan isn't all that good because plans are meant to change. This rigid document that says do this, this, and this, but planning is everything because planning requires people to come face to face, people to work through these issues and at least know how they're going to work through them when the unknown occurs. It's not a matter of if, just when, and where. It's going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. Pandemic influenza is going to happen. There's a lack of international political will and support right now. We are spending money on the most incredible, inane issues around the world right now, and we're missing the big point. I don't mean to offend anybody in this room, but we can spend days on an emergency basis dealing with Terry Scheibel, and we haven't done anything of any real nature on this. I think that is the ultimate disgrace in the quantity and quality of human life. At a minimum, we assume we'll have no vaccine for the first 6 to 8 months, and then supply is going to be very limited. The 1918-20 experience provides, I think, many important lessons. Everything we see here is a deja vu all over again. And what's really scary about it is we're not any better prepared as a modern society with antibiotics, with ventilators, with all other drugs, than we were in 1918 in many ways. If you want more information on this, including access to the papers we've published here, as well as a lot of background material on what we can do and how we can do it, I would urge you to visit our center website, www.cidrap.umn.edu. There's a lot of material on there about influenza. So in conclusion, I want to thank you all very much for working through this with me. And if I leave you feeling a bit shallow tonight, that's good. That's the first step. What we need to do now is not what each of you in this room can do to solve the problem. You can't. We need our leaders to solve this problem. This is where government should be. This is what government must be. What you can do is make government do that. And you know what? Right now, I don't care if I'm the biggest pain in the ass of government in the world. And having been so much time in Washington, understanding where the squeaky wheel gets oiled, I must say, there hasn't been an outcry from the general public yet, so our world leaders don't get it. It's got to start. Where's public health been? Where's managed care been? Where's organized medicine been? They haven't been there. They've been largely AWOL. And we got to get them involved. And I think you can start by very, very much helping out, requiring your elected officials to answer questions. What are you doing about this? Every government at federal, state, and local level should have a plan what they're going to do about this. And not just some generic, off-the-wall, we will respond. It's got to be detailed. And once they start realizing the complexities of that detail, then I think they'll start to get the significance of this particular issue. Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah. Questions, comments? No tomatoes, please. Maureen? There's a microphone,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Thank you.
If it could be done, and it would be very difficult, but if it could be done to keep all borders open in the face of a pandemic, what would be the relative advantages of that approach as opposed to closing all borders?
First of all, let me just say that I'm convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that closing borders will at the very best very minimally limit the spread of this around the world. It will move quickly because even if we want to keep people out, people move around, particularly if they have a perception that there's a better place somewhere else to be in this situation. And with it, they'll take influenza with them. It was interesting in SARS, for example, which is really relatively hard to transmit. Only a limited number of super shedders really played a key role. And yet one individual was able to transmit it to people that went to 5 different countries and 3 continents in 24 hours. I mean, it just moves around the world before we even know what happens. But I have no doubt that elected officials, lacking anything else, and of course leadership means action, will do something. And I mean, I can tell you, I'm convinced that's what they'll do. But even if they don't do it, I think the public will do it. I can tell you one of the most memorable experiences I had during the outbreak of meningitis in Mankato a few years ago, as heading up that investigation and response, was a CEO of a major trucking company based in Minnesota who refused to let his trucks deliver any goods in Mankato.